Before the pyramids rose, before kings claimed divine right, there was a place of light so dangerous that every empire that discovered it chose to bury it again. They carved its memory into stone and sealed its words beneath sand and silence. If you believe history begins where the textbooks say, then this book will ask you to step back and listen to a voice older than the pharaohs, speaking from beneath the dunes. They called it silence for a reason. The desert keeps its secrets the same way the ocean keeps its depths, patient, indifferent, and lethal to anyone who disturbs what it has decided to conceal. For centuries the sand swallowed arrow and plumb line, temple and camp, the footprints of empires and those who forgot them. Then, like a slow breath rising from the earth, the desert released a corridor of stone, a doorway into the world's oldest book. This is not the kind of discovery that arrives with fanfare and measured pens. It arrives like a rumor, whispered first to herders and then to smugglers, then to one stubborn scholar whose life had been measured in midnight catalogues and second-hand maps. He found the first glyph by chance, a triangle of carved light beneath a collapsed lintel, a mark older than any catalogue of kings. The glyph did not belong to the timeline the textbooks had built. Its angle spoke in a geometry that hummed like a tuning fork. Where the scholars expected funerary marks or dedications of familiar gods, they found instructions, not prayers, how to order a room for thought, how to read the world as if it were a page. What the scholar had stumbled upon was not a tomb. It was a library. If this sentence makes your chest tighten, if you sense an old, unnameable awe, then you are already stepping toward the same precipice the ancients once stood upon. Libraries are not merely collections of objects. They are contracts, agreement between a people and their future that knowledge will be kept intact, that memory will not be allowed to die. To discover a lost library beneath the sand is to find a culture that valued the future of thought above the vanity of praise, above the hunger for dominion. The hallways were narrow and cool as bone. Stone benches ran beneath slits of light that fell through fissures in the roof like time's own score. Shelves, not of wood but of baked clay and stone, lined the walls, each slab inlaid with a script neither wholly pictographic nor purely alphabetical. The language was older than the catalogues of pharaohs and priests, yet eerily, intoxicatingly systematic. It taught method more than myth. It contained diagrams that looked less like spells and more like instruction for the mind, ways to cultivate precision in observation, methods to map the stars in patterns that matched architecture, and a mathematics of resonance meant to raise structures into song. They named the place in their own tongues, the House of Remembered Orders, the Silent Archive, the Library Beneath. The scholars, because scholars cannot resist a neat label, called it a throwback to a prehistoric Sophia, a body of systematic thought predating the rise of state cults. The villagers, listening at the edge of the excavation tents, called it by the old names, names that resonated like charms, names for teachers and schools and nights when strange lights rode the dunes like returning ships. But naming is not the same as knowing. The more the world tried to reduce what they had found into a neat taxonomy, the more the library resisted. The inscriptions refused straightforward translation. They folded meaning into geometry and metaphor into measure. One stanza, carved into the column of a reading room, read like a recipe and a warning at once. Teach the body to receive only truth. Make the heart a vessel for retain. Do not make the unseen public, for the world hungers. Those are not the words of kings. They are the words of guardians. Guardianship implies a choice. Whoever built this library had decided that certain knowledge must survive, but not all at once. They crafted layers, basic tools for common life and deeper keys for those whose mind could hold paradox without breaking. Here was engineering that smoothed stone into resonance chambers. Here were botanical recipes that accelerated growth not through brute force but through timing. Here was a map of the stars that did not merely chart the heavens but taught how to listen to cycles. Most crucially, there were instructions for preserving memory through resets, ways to hide knowledge from enemies without annihilating its essence. It did not take long for the pattern to become clear. The library was not an isolated invention. Its symbol set, the tuning triangles, the concentric rings, the chain of small dots like beads, reappeared across coasts and mountains, in fragments of clay found at sites the archaeologists had long dismissed, in the margins of scrolls burned or vandalized by conquerors. It was a blueprint migrated across time. There had been, the pattern suggested, a template for society so durable it could teach itself to reappear after cataclysm. And there was a rub. If such an earlier configuration of civilization had existed, it would topple the comfortable narrative that history liked to tell about human progress, that humanity crawled slowly toward intelligence, that salvation and enlightenment were things granted by gods who favored certain houses. The script in the library suggested something more audacious, that before kings and priests imposed structure, humans had already learned to bend the world through shared techniques of thought. They had built systems that grew food and mapped stars and stitched meaning into stone without appealing to divine monopoly. They had created community institutions dedicated not to worship but to competence. This was a different kind of threat for power. It is one thing to discredit a myth with argument, another to wither an institution by proving it unnecessary. What do you do with a religion that claims exclusive access to the heavens when a century-old text proves architecture could sing and plants listen to timing? The answer the ages often chose was not a debate but a burying. History remembers conquests as battles and treaties. It rarely records quiet erasures. Yet erasure is its own art. Where armies fail, culture can succeed, confiscate archives, rebrand stories as superstition, turn teachers into heretics. The library's presence was a contradiction the powerful could not afford. Empires found it easier to absorb the visible tokens of authority, crowns, temples, and statues, and subtly suffocate the living processes that taught independence. The first wave of suppression in the layers of sand was surgical. Scribes from later dynasties copied only the myths that complemented their rule. They reproposed geometry into sacred ornament, reducing instruction to symbol. They placed the library's more practical diagrams into allegory. Where the library spoke of agricultural cycles tuned to astronomy, later priests reinterpreted these as divine favor. Where the library taught how to tune the resonance of stone, later stonemasons were required to carve dedications to gods. Knowledge that once emancipated the populace slid into the hands of intermediaries. But the library resisted being silenced entirely. Knowledge, once written, moves like water. It seeps through cracks. Farmers remembered seed timing in recipes and recited them as superstition. Shipwrights imitated proportions that favored stability and called them tradition. Artisans kept geometric patterns alive in guild marks and temple architecture. Across the next centuries, the encoded teachings of the library survived in disguised form, embedded in ritual, in craft, in the patterning of the built world. This half-truth, a living tradition masked by dogma, produced a strange hybrid we call civilization. Institutions sat on top of practical systems. Priests borrowed the language of competence, and craftsmen became the memory keepers of the old techniques. From the viewpoint of rulers, this was optimal. The outward structures of power remained intact while the substratum of practical knowledge diffused into anonymous practice. The ruling classes could claim credit for grand monuments and relegate the means of maintenance to guilds whose craft never formed a narrative of liberation. But buried or masked, the library left one indelible imprint. It taught a method of relational thinking that resisted simplification. Where modern governance often reduces people to roles and functions, the library's voice insisted on interlocking awareness, that to transform a field, one must listen to water and soil and rhythm. To build a whole, one must tune stone to vibration. To map the heavens, one must calculate not just position but resonance. In other words, it taught an ethic of reciprocity between mind and world. Such an ethic was dangerous for institutions that relied on separation and hierarchy. Some among the early priests saw the danger and acted with far more deliberation than historians often credit. They formed committees disguised as councils and made decisions that, over centuries, became policy. The script that was the library's undoing was not force of arms but policy of omission, destroy selected scrolls, delegitimize teachers, and criminalize certain patterns of thought as a cult. They developed rhetoric. These teachings are dangerous for common minds. They must be protected from the weak. The same logic that once elevated the library's guardians as protectors now ran like a poison into the apparatus of control. The library's wisdom became a scandal in the language of power. If the people knew how to think the old way, no priest could stand. Thus began a cycle familiar to every epoch: discovery, incorporation, fear, suppression. But suppression is never total. The library's keepers, call them initiates, teachers, or survivors, understood that the safest place to hide knowledge was in plain sight. They disguised techniques as crafts and preserved key practices and initiation ceremonies that looked like rites but functioned as curriculum. They taught children in the margins and hid core instructions within mnemonic songs. The perishable forms were protected by living practice. The living practice survived through community. The more the centers of power tightened, the more subtle the keepers became. A secret society might refuse to write anything at all, preferring to pass knowledge through embodied practice. Another might scatter its fragments across continents, planting seeds in unrelated traditions so that no single conqueror could silence the whole. The pattern is ancient. When books are burnt, bodies remember. It was in tracing those echoes, in the geometric measures embroidered into cathedral rose windows and in the precise angular alignments of old city plans, that modern scholars began to see the library's fingerprints. Gothic vaults and Minoan harbors somehow sang the same structure. A mason in one age and a shipwright in another echoed the same ratio, the same tuning. The modern mind, eager for discrete cause and effect, called this coincidence or cultural transmission. But the deeper possibility is more haunting. Perhaps certain ideas are hard to eradicate because they are not ideas alone but practices that alter the world in ways kings cannot control. And yet even the most ingenious camouflage could not prevent all loss. There are stories, half legend, half document, of times when knowledge reasserted itself with the force of necessity. A drought, followed by a plague, returned communities to the pragmatic demands of survival. Those who remembered the old timing and the seasonal mapping of stars could coax fields back to life. In such moments, the old teachers emerged like subterranean rivers, their practices suddenly indispensable. Kings found their palaces vulnerable not to swords but to the competence of those who could work the land. Power responded to existential threats as it always has, by trying to re-establish dominance through control of knowledge. In certain regimes, the guardians were invited into palaces, not as equals but as consultants who would supply technique while the rulers retained narrative. In that bargain, the library's secret bore a new and treacherous form. Knowledge traded for sanction, guarded only by those approved to possess it. The methods lost their democratic character and returned to being a privilege of the few. This history repeats into our modern era. The archive beneath the desert is thus not merely an ancient curiosity but a mirror held up to contemporary structures. We live within systems that shape cognition, that determine what counts as legitimate knowledge. Our universities, our think tanks, our corporations, they are the new temples, and their librarians decide which truths are permitted to circulate widely. The discovery of the lost library forces a question we would rather avoid. Whose competence do we cultivate, and who is excluded by the credentialing and rituals of modern institutions? Yet the library also holds a different possibility. Its voice, when read beyond the politics, returns insistently to the idea that knowledge is an art of sustaining life, not of dominating it. Its recipes, tuned to rhythm and relationship, ask us to treat ecosystems as partners, to find architectural forms that hum rather than shout, to teach in ways that create independent capacity rather than dependence. Its core ethic is radical only if you accept the premise that the current ordering of knowledge is neutral. It is not neutral. It privileges certain forms of power. The library proposes an alternative, knowledge that restores reciprocity. And if that sounds threatening, if you feel your spine tighten at the thought of practices that might undermine centralized authority, then you understand why the library was made a target in the first place. There is nothing neutral about systems that exclude the possibility of autonomy. To remember that knowledge can be a technology of empowerment is to undermine the monopoly of intermediaries. The final chapters carved into that undersand archive are not apocalyptic instructions for the end of the world. They are, in a way, more dangerous, a map for reconstitution. The Guardians left blueprints for rebuilding in case of collapse, protocols for soil recovery, methods of recording and transferring subtle techniques, and designs for communal spaces that amplify listening. They insisted on redundancy, that crucial knowledge be carried in multiple forms: song, craft, geometry, and ritual. Their hope was not to hoard power, but to ensure that catastrophe could not snuff the capacity to recreate. The choice the ancients made then is a choice we face now. Will we continue to shield the keys to competence behind credentials and arcane language, or will we design our institutions to teach independence? The question at the heart of the library is not nostalgic. It is practical. If climate, conflict, or unseen forces bring a rupture we cannot yet imagine, who will know how to rebuild the crop cycles, the water systems, the resonance of stone? If those skills are sequestered within a privileged class, survival becomes a hoarded commodity. There is an intimacy in the library that is almost tender, not because it promises salvation, but because it trusts human capacity. It assumes people can learn to listen to cycles, to attune to seasons, to tune structures to song. It presumes human competence. That presumption, radical in the ages of priests and kings, is a library's quiet bravery. When the last stone of the widening corridor was catalogued, and the world turned its specialized gaze to translate a stanza, there came the inevitable moment of choice. The text did not demand worship or allegiance to a name. They demanded practice. They asked for commons, shared spaces where learning was visible and reproducible. They required time and patience, seasons of failure and correction. Their pedagogy resisted spectacle and rewarded humility. It is no surprise that institutions devoted to spectacle and centralized worship once found them inconvenient. What shall we do with this knowledge now that it is partially awake beneath our feet? There are those who will try to claim it, to package the methods into proprietary courses, to sell the reconstitution of community as a brand. Others will advocate for open labs and shared seed banks, for public apprenticeships in the old ways. The library itself gives no instruction on political economy. It states a procedural fact. Knowledge that is practiced widely is survivable. Knowledge that is hoarded is fragile. Perhaps the deepest, most difficult inheritance of the library is a moral one. That remembrance is an ethical act. When a society chooses forgetting as a policy, it becomes complicit in erasure. The ancients who buried parts of the archive may have believed in chastening the masses, protecting the weak, or preserving the elite. Those are human rationales, but they are rationales that produce dependency and, over time, brittle civilizations. There is no mythic finality in this history. The desert may yield more than this archive, or it may slip its stones back beneath shifting sand and let the memory slumber for another age. What survives in human practice is less grand but more reliable. The small recipes, the songs of seed planters, the proportions kept by masons. In these things the library has already done its work. It taught a future, and let the future choose whether to remember. If you feel the pull of that question, whether to preserve competence as a shared public good or to repackage it into dominion, then you are facing the library's invitation. The choice is not between ancient mysticism and modern reason. It is between building institutions that amplify human autonomy or ones that rob people of the ability to respond. The sands under which the library rests are patient, but they are not impartial. They will take what we do now and keep it as testimony. Will they receive seeds of renewed community or more sealed archives of privilege? The lost library beneath the sand does not judge, it witnesses. It watches empires raise and fall like the line of a heartbeat. Its pages record not kings but competences, not God but processes. So listen, the desert teaches in rhythms. It reminds us that knowledge is least secure when it is used as a tool for power, and most secure when it is used as a common craft. The ancient librarians carved into stone an ethic we still need, teach widely, build redundantly, make the world readable by many hands. That is its true danger and its deepest gift.